My name is Frank Rokas. I'm a Deputy Assistant Inspector General for the Office of Audit. And with me is Ruth Risma, who's head of our investigative group, the Assistant Inspector General for Investigations. It's kind of appropriate that we kind of come at the end of the presentation here, because usually that's when we come in and audits at the end. The difference is going to be is we're going to be trying to do more upfront auditing this year. And what the presentation is going to talk about is who we are and what we do. I'm going to run through the first slides real fast. Most of you know who we are and what we do. We're statutorily set up with independent authority through the IG Act. Our mission and HUD's mission kind of are the same mission. The difference is we report directly to the Inspector General, the Inspector General reports to Congress and the President in cooperation with working with the Secretary. So we're independent of HUD itself, even though we're considered HUD employees. There's two main offices within the Inspector General's office, the Office of Audit and the Office of Investigations. I'm going to go through the Office of Audit, and Ruth is then going to cover the Office of Investigations. The Office of Audit conducts independent and objective audits. We keep the Secretary and Congress and the American public fully informed, and work collaboratively with HUD staff. Throughout this entire thing since the Sandy storm, we've actually been working with the HUD staff. We've had a couple different meetings already with the HUD staff. Once the money came out and the notices came out, we're reviewing the notices and making comments on those. Again, we conduct audits. We have access to all records, information of the agencies and program participants. That's at the grantee level, the sub-grantee, and the recipient level. The other authority that we have that most people don't know is we have Subpoena Authority for records and documents. And we have that administratively, which means we can issue our own subpoenas and have them enforced administratively on the grantees, the recipients, sub-recipients. And that's true for the Office of Audit as well as the Office of Investigations. We divide our audits into what we refer to as internal, external audits. Internal audits is where we audit actually components within HUD, such as CPD or public housing. And then we do external audits, which is to look at the grant funds that go externally to the different parties. We also review legislations and regulations. For example, the notices that went out, we reviewed the notices and made comments on the notices. We develop an annual audit plan for audit of what we plan to do nationally every year. That's on our website. And we do audit follow-ups, which means that after we do an audit, we might come back and do an audit verification. And then the Office of Audit also supports the Office of Investigations in criminal matters and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Some elements when we consider risk and programs, funding type and amount, HUD monitoring efforts, HUD-assisted risk levels. For Superstorm Sandy and the money going out for Sandy, we've already identified it as high risk for a number of reasons. One is it's a very short-term amount of money that you have to spend, that 2-year window. Plus, there's a lot of new changes in how Congress wrote the legislation for it, and also how HUD's going to be doing some of its monitoring. Even before Superstorm Sandy rolled in, we had already started a roll-up of work that we've done for various disasters. And so that audit report is being finalized now and should be posted to our website, hopefully in a couple of 2 or 3 weeks. And that's kind of what I want to go over for the Office of Audit, is what lessons we learned from the previous hurricanes in the South. Audit work performed. As you can see, most of our work for those disasters were formed in Louisiana and Mississippi, because those are the most impacted areas. Monetary impact. When we look at monetary findings, we have what we refer to as ineligible or question costs. Those are monies that usually have to be repaid back to the department. We also look at funds put to better use. That's where a grantee will spend money for something and really wasn't in the best interest, and they didn't get what they got paid for. Or they provided assistance to somebody that wasn't really eligible, but that assistance would have gone to somebody else. When we did the roll-up audits, the main areas that we found were contracting, eligibility of recipients, duplication of benefits, sub-recipients, IT systems, and insurance issues. And I'll go through each one of those briefly. For contracting issues, ineligible contracts or cost-plus contracts, violations of the procurement requirements for the state. They didn't follow their own rules. Inadequate procurement history and documentation. They couldn't explain why they really needed the contract, and the documentation was vague on what was going on. Poorly written or vague contracts. This is going to be a big difference in these contracts coming out this time as compared to the others, because now you have specific requirements. You're going to have to show performance measures for the contracts and also penalties. That's the first time ever for that, so that's going to be a new area for us to look at too. And then the other thing is significant modifications without determining whether additional competition was necessary. A lot of times the grantees already had a contractor, so instead of going out and getting a new contract for something that wasn't related to that contract, they did a contract modification. And usually it's not documented why they needed to go with, why they were using their existing contractor. Eligibility of recipients. Again, lack of documentation to support the eligibility of recipients. Unfortunately, these disasters bring out the people that just want to get something for nothing, and so they're always out there trying to apply for grants, or they're trying to apply for housing that were never eligible for housing. We saw a lot of that in, especially the people that left Louisiana and moved to Texas, a whole bunch of people claiming that they had moved there that never lived in Louisiana in their life, but wanted to get onto the vouchers and get their Section 8 vouchers, and so they were all applying. Duplication of benefits. That's probably one of our biggest areas we're going to be looking at here again, is duplication of benefits. Trying to match up records from FEMA, HUD records. Also for this, for eligibility to recipients, one of the things is, as we mentioned earlier, was what's your primary residence? Is this a secondary home? Is it a primary resident home? One of the things we did in some of our work is we actually matched up our information from Public Housing Section 8 with beneficiaries receiving assistance for houses that were destroyed, and we found people that were on Section 8 that were claiming to live in houses that were destroyed, and we found out that they were actually the girlfriend or boyfriend of somebody that owned that house, and they were collecting Section 8 on someplace else. And that goes to assistance to ineligible recipients. Again, people that weren't impacted but want to claim it so they can get some other sort of assistance. Especially in Rita and Katrina, where so many people lost housing, there was no rental housing, so a lot of them moved to Texas. And like I said, there we saw huge numbers under Katie Happ, where people just wanted to get into Section 8 housing and have somebody else pay for it. Sub-recipients. The presentation just before this was very good because it still reminded, even though you're a sub-recipient, you're probably going to still have all the same requirements that the grantee has to run the programs. And you're supposed to have the oversight to ensure that sub-recipients have followed his policies and procedures and complied with program requirements, we're meeting deadlines, only spent funds on eligible expenses, and report on results as required. And just because you're a sub-recipient doesn't mean that the grantee has to do all that. The grantee is just supposed to monitor you, but you really have to carry out the full program yourself as a sub-recipient. IT systems. This was a big area for contracting when we looked at the disasters. A lot of the grantees didn't have the IT infrastructures in place to be able to track their program dollars and what was going to happen. And so they contracted out for IT systems. Significant amount of the money were spent on developing IT systems, but the states didn't own the systems or the data that was in it. One of the things we mentioned before is if you stop a contract for non-performance, what happens? Well, a lot of times you get the data and it's either in stacks of paper, or they hand you the data tapes and you find out you can't read the data tapes without their proprietary software, so you got to recontract with them to get the proprietary software. So it kind of goes back to writing good contracts and making sure, you know, that in the contract you talk about what happens if I've got to get out of this contract for non-performance. Can I still get to the data? Can I get to the information that I have? Can I get to the records? Especially now in the age of when we're moving away from paper and moving to electronics, it becomes very much important that you as grantees ensure in your contract documents that you're going to be able to get to those electronic records. And that's becoming a big problem, both not only in just CPD, but in just overall government as a whole. License additional software licenses. Yeah, I mean, the example here is 2 of the states had to go out and get additional licenses to be able to read the software. Insurance issues. This was kind of one of those new things that we didn't really think about when we were doing it until we started doing the roll-ups of audits. But what happens afterwards? Because we were looking at disasters over a period of time, especially down in some of the areas in Louisiana and Mississippi that got hit multiple times. So what happened with the insurance? If they were still in a flood zone, were they required to get flood insurance? How long they were required to get flood insurance for? A lot of times we found where they repaired a house, but they didn't require future insurance on flood insurance. So 3 years later, they got another grant to repair what we repaired 3 years prior. So those are things you need to think about, is how you're going to do your insurance for those particular areas. And again, insurance is one of those real fun things where the insurance companies don't want to pay because they only pay for wind damage. They don't pay for flood damage. And so the argument is always, what caused the damage, the wind or the flood? So, and here's an example of a house that was actually a mobile home that was replaced. And again, it's in a flood insurance area, a flood zone, and no flood insurance. And you can see the tree laying on top of it from the wind that's taken out the house again. And this is the structural inside part of the underside of that unit that's been destroyed. How to avoid audit findings. What I tell my staff is, go down there, we'll do what we refer to as a survey, which is a quick look at what's going on. If we don't find anything bad, fold up your tent and we'll go someplace else. The IG has changed its methodology over the years. We're not going to go in and stay for 6 months until we find something to write up. We have too much work to do that anymore. But how to avoid the findings is really what HUD's talked about throughout this presentation. Know the rules and regulations related to your grant money. Know what the statute says. Know what the notices say, and tie those to your actual programs. Communicate with HUD, especially on fraud, waste, and mismanagement. If you see something bad out there, don't just kind of turn your head. Either refer it to HUD, refer it to the IG's office. Get training. HUD's putting on a number of training programs for these things. And again, you're going to deal with things that really have never been dealt with before, because there's new things in this statute that weren't out there before. And, ask questions. Keep good documentation. We were talking to some people from the state of New York yesterday about documentation. Can we just get a certification from a person, for example? Well, yeah, but what are they certifying to? How do we hold them accountable to that certification? Those are all things that you should be considering when you're creating your documents, your policies, and your procedures, because you're going to have people wanting duplication of benefits. You're going to have ineligible people. So you need to plan for those things. And you need to look at your program from beginning to end, not just, how to get the money out there. And there's going to be a lot of political pressure, as well as the media, just to get the money out there, as we've mentioned, or some of the presenters have mentioned, long lines waiting to do that. Develop and implement a good control structure. We talk about as internal controls. I'm an auditor by profession. There's a number of models out there, but the thing about it is internal controls are not something that you set up at the beginning of your program and you don't reevaluate. You need to reevaluate your internal controls as you go along to see if it's working and do we need to make changes. And I know sometimes people go, we took us so long to get to this point, we don't want to make changes, but you still got to look at, do we have something here that we now see that really wasn't working, so we need to make a change? And you really should consider that. And any good internal control structure is the fact that you monitor the control structure and modify it accordingly if it's not really working the way you want it to work. But again, good documentation is really the key to this whole thing, and maintaining the records. Okay. One of the things I want to call from the Office of Audit is we've already had a number of pre-meetings with our auditors. For those of you that didn't read the actual statutory language, HUD's Office of Inspector General did get additional funding to do work here, and we're going to be staffing up for that work. The one thing I can guarantee, all the state recipients or grantees we're going to be visiting every state. There's not that many, so we'll be visiting every state. Now, how much we go down to the sub-recipients in that is going to be another question. Some of the bigger grants, I can assure you, will be going down to the sub-recipient levels. But we've already planned that out. We're in the process of actually trying to get out in front of it by doing some reviews of your submissions, your action plans, and looking at what's going to be going on, and also looking at the disaster areas. We are 2 primary offices are going to be doing this, our office in New York and New Jersey, and our office in Philadelphia are going to be handling most of the workload. We also have volunteers from across the country that want to come here and do some work in disaster, so we're going to be pulling in some of the staff that also has experience from Louisiana and Texas in previous disasters. One thing is, I can guarantee you we will be there to visit every state, so you can plan for that visit. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ruth.
Okay, so I'm on the investigation side from Washington, D.C., but actually I was the special agent in charge in New York, New Jersey, and live in Jersey, so this storm has been in my backyard as well, so which is kind of ironic. I have a map here of the HUD Office of Investigations. I think I heard that there was some incredulousness regarding the fact that the Inspector General had agents and that they actually carry firearms and badges, and that is true, and I'll go into a little bit more about what we do. But I wanted to just let you know where our 2 offices are, and these are the same offices as Frank has with Audit. These will be the 2 offices that are going to be handling the disaster fraud for the OIG and then Audit offices. And I know Joe Clark is the head of the Philly office. He's standing back there by the door. And Carrie Rubenstein, Carrie, if you could stand up. And I think John Buck's here? No? Okay. Joe Visor. There's a few of our folks that are here. The reason I put these phone numbers in here and addresses is because, you know, you always hear that, we're here to help, we're the government. Okay, well, we really, when it comes to fighting fraud, we're partners with you. You're the front line, and we really depend on that information coming, you know, to us so that we can get resources as we go through this. So I just can't overestimate the importance of communication. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the IG in the investigations division. I'm sure that's very small. Our investigations vary in purpose and scope, but it always involves HUD-related information, anything with HUD programs. It could be criminal, it could be civil laws, or it could be an administrative requirement. And we conduct investigations that cover that gamut, even though generally we stick with criminal and we have a pretty strong civil component. Not sure how that's going to play in with disaster fraud, but we just had like a $25 billion settlement with bankers with mortgage fraud. So the focus is on the integrity of the programs and operations of HUD. It's the same thing you guys want. It's to make sure that the money gets to where it's supposed to get to and not to fraudsters who are willing to do whatever it takes to steal it. We work with federal, state, and local levels of government. We use all kinds of special investigative techniques. Yes, we do carry firearms. We do have arrest authorities. We have, as unusual for law enforcement, we have the IG subpoena power, which means that we don't actually have to go through the U.S. Attorney's offices to get subpoenas, even though we certainly will go get grand jury subpoenas when they're appropriate. Wiretaps, undercover operations, we do the whole thing. What the Inspector Generals are, our partners include, and is the first line up there, there's 73 federal Inspector General's offices. A lot of them are very small. We're one of the largest and original Inspector Generals. And overall, there's over 2,000 special agents in the Inspector General community that augment what the rest of traditional federal law enforcement does, the FBI, Secret Service, ATF, DEA, the ones that everybody thinks about. what the IGs are, we're very specialized. We really understand the programs that we are assigned to and the frauds related to that. So in our case, we have a lot of experience with disaster fraud and, and then all the other HUD program frauds. Other partners, key partners in this, especially in disaster fraud, is going to be the FBI, Postal Inspection, IRS. A lot of times we get these fraudsters with tax charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office is our main partner in terms of prosecuting cases, but we often work with the State Attorney General's offices and the local DA's offices. It depends on the nature of the crime, and we will work very closely with that. I know that there's been some disaster fraud task forces at the local level that have come together to look at fraud in their local areas. We'll be involved in that and work with them. Other federal, state, and local agencies include state licensing agencies, the Insurance Commission. We're constantly having meetings with these folks in an effort to do information sharing. And these fraudsters are pretty indiscriminate in how they steal money and in terms of how they go about doing it. It doesn't matter if it's HUD funds or FEMA funds or SBA funds, they're just getting whatever they can. So that really requires us to work together with our law enforcement partners so that we can help develop strategies to deal with these and identify maybe patterns that would point to specific frauds. The Department of Justice has already had 3 major meetings, I think. I think maybe one was canceled, but that involved the inspector generals that are affected, SBA, FEMA, those IGs that have substantial amounts of money, to educate the local U.S. attorneys on disaster fraud, and we'll continue doing that. Briefly, fraud is an intentional deception with results in action of reliance by an injury to a damage to another party. You guys know what fraud is. It's can be done in a number of ways. The challenge with disaster fraud overall is that the nature of disasters or Stafford Act incidents is that the government and nonprofits really want to respond as quickly as possible with as little red tape and time to get folks what they need as quickly as they need it. Department of Justice recognized that, worked with the Inspector Generals and Congress, and got a law passed, Title 18 U.S.C. 1040, which is fraud in connection with major disasters. This is specifically designed to help us with the fact that oftentimes in disaster fraud, the documentation or some of the controls that would normally be in place, maybe by government entities but maybe Red Cross has got money that they put out, and then the insurances, and there's such an overlap in how the frauds occur. These folks are drawing from all those sources. This statute is very broad, and very surprisingly that it gives us the ability to kind of put a check and balance when we have worked so quickly to get money to people who desperately need it. It's a 30-year felony for people, depending. It's all gradated. Obviously, there's going to be individuals who will steal $10,000 from Red Cross, but we've had sophisticated schemes that involve hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, and depending on the amount of the money. It's a pretty serious statute. It's a huge tool in the arsenal of law enforcement. And we're hoping that that helps deter some of these more sophisticated criminals. So who can perpetrate fraud? Contractors. Contracting fraud is not uncommon, certainly in CDBG, for the IG to look at. And you have to understand, my perspective is all we do every day is look at fraud, waste and abuse allegations on that. So this is an area that's vulnerable. Obviously there's a a lot that HUD is doing to make, and all of you guys are doing to make sure that that doesn't happen. But there's certainly folks that figure out ways to get around that. Employees of the agencies and the nonprofits, management, actual beneficiaries, organized crime. We certainly hear chatter, this is a very lucrative area to steal from, and we've had it I know, no surprise that there's different wiretaps and so on, and we certainly hear that these people that are very sophisticated at stealing money are looking at the billions, $50 billion that's getting slammed into this area, as they were down in the Gulf Coast. And just general criminals that take advantage of people and programs. So some of the investigations that we do, false statements and false claims has always kind of been our go-to. Now with this new 1040 statute, which has much more teeth and it's just more open, I think that you're going to see that more. Insurance frauds, thefts, bribes, kickbacks, again in the contract fraud, bid rigging, prevailing wage fraud, no-show jobs, artificial price market inflation. I don't know what the price of boardwalks is going to be soon, but I'll have to get someone to look at that. Contract fraud, invoicing and double billing, environmental crimes, public corruption by organized crime, or public corruption, and I should say organized crime, definitely separate, though sometimes the same. False payrolls, wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, identity theft isn't up there. I mean, it goes on, it's just limited by the imagination of the criminal. Just for context, I wanted to, for the 5 years of the Coast Disaster Fraud, now this is just the IG, HUD OIG. We got 1,464 complaints for that 5-year period. We did 381 investigations, 269 indictments, 264 convictions, about $2 million in quartered restitution and fines. This is just HUD IG. This isn't what we did jointly with other agencies, the Bureau, SBA. FEMA certainly had a significant amount of work. So overall, there was 1,460 folks indicted by DOJ on Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. And that doesn't include the thousands and thousands that were indicted by local prosecutors' offices. Quite frankly, there's so many cases. Unfortunately, DOJ didn't get money for judges or grand juries or anything like that. The backlog was years. And so we have to move through that. What steps can you take to prevent fraud? I think that the number one thing is awareness and, having your, you have so much to do, and I know that, and then there's so much going on. But your folks are, and your grantees, your sub-grantees, your contractors, they're going to be the front line, and they're going to see things that raise hairs on their neck or whatever. And sometimes they're just going to say, oh, it's a duplication of benefit or whatever. But actually, those might be some major frauds. And I'll tell you, our best leads really come from you guys. So we will be working with the major grantees and also with the smaller grantees in the future. Once these action plans are decided on, we get a better understanding, you have more of your people in place. Each state, City of New York will do separate, State of New York, and the State of New Jersey. We will work with Department of Justice, the FBI, ourselves, DHS, OIG, SBA, OIG, some of the major players, and provide what we did in the Gulf Coast was provide one-day trainings for those people that you deem that are at the front end that would benefit from fraud awareness training and detection and training. Create an environment in which employees understand that dishonest acts will be detected and promptly addressed. Again, this is probably stuff that you do routinely in your offices. Send a message that your operation is proactively looking for fraud and will immediately report it to the authorities. What I put here is, this is a HUD OIG fraud, waste, and abuse poster, but I didn't mention when I went through the partners, one of the partners that is very important. This is a kind of a newly created. It started, the genesis was really probably 9/11 and the U.S. Attorney's response to 9/11 in New York City, working with DOI and so on. And then with Hurricane Katrina, when we kind of reinvented everything we had done for 9/11, DOJ established the National Center for Disaster Fraud. And actually, it's physically located at LSU in Baton Rouge. It's funded by Department of Justice. And what they are is a center to find, it's getting waved, okay, to find fraud. And I think that since the public in general doesn't really know who HUD OIG is, and nor do they care, this is a much smarter way of reporting fraud. And this is a copy of the poster. They have cards, they have flyers, you know, and when we go through the training with you, we'll have all of that material available to you. There'll, you know, I encourage the states to reach out to us if they have the grantees, if you guys have ideas. You know, they've done public service announcements, they put billboards in the locations to report fraud. As we know, I mean, everybody's dealing with contractor fraud that's, you know, ripping off the individuals and so on. And this is the kind of stuff that we want to report, charity fraud, all of that kind of stuff. So it really runs the gamut. Now what we have is at that location, you have representatives from all the agencies there. So when we get an allegation that involves HUD money, then the HUD agent and we have a forensic auditor there, they'll look at that, and oftentimes it involves multiple programs. So that's there, it's available, it's there for you guys to use, and we can use it however we need to use it. So again, this is our website, and you know, we're just going to be here to help you. You know, protect yourself, protect your funds, and you know, any questions, anything that you have any concerns about, really please call us. Our names are on our numbers are available, and we'll work with you to whatever degree you want to work with to protect yourselves. So that's all I have.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing, is that we're also going to be meeting with the other IGs that are receiving funding for this disaster, and working in cooperation with them, and trying to get some matching agreements in place so that we can look for duplication of benefits specifically on those matching agreements. And then helping the grantees better prepare the programs. If you want to look at some of the audit reports that are out there, all of our audit reports are posted on the web. Like I said, we have one coming up, which is a roll-up of some of the disaster work that we've done. Should be available in a couple of weeks on the web. We're just finalizing comments and going to be issuing that relatively soon. So, any questions?
Thank you. My questions relate to procurement and your audits regarding procurement. Can you give us any guidance on what issues you've observed in disaster recovery procurements that might give us some better guidance on best procurement practices?
Procurement's the real problem is what do you need and why are you procuring it? And so the biggest thing we find is that the procurement doesn't really talk about what you need and why you need it. And there's not a good job in writing out the scope of work that you're planning for the contractor to do related to that procurement, or why you need that particular item. And then the real difference in this go-around is going to be the fact that they're actually putting performance measures in the contract requirements now for procurements, as well as penalties, which weren't in the previous items. The other thing we really see a lot of is people, because of the rush and the short time frame of trying to get the money out, they don't really do a good procurement, or they think before they issue it, you know, there's only 2 or 3 people that can do this job. Is there more? And part of the problem with some of the procurement is the fact that the area impacted, especially in the Gulf Coast when that hit, there wasn't a lot of contractors left to do the work because they all moved out. And when they started coming back, they didn't have materials and other things to do it. We shouldn't have that shouldn't be as big an impact in the hurricane area here, because along the coast and interior-wise didn't get impacted as much. So you should be able to do some of those things. But it's really just the grantees not following their own policies and procedures. And usually it's because of the pressure to get something done, either by the press or by the, political people that are overseeing the program. I mean, everybody wants to get everything done in a hurry, and the reality is, yeah, we understand you have to get it done in a hurry, but you also have to take the time to really think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And also, not just in the front end to get something done, but on the back end of it, how are we going to monitor this? How are we going to, make sure we got what we're paid for? One of the big areas we saw was the IT systems that a lot of grantees had in Texas as well as Louisiana and Mississippi, because they didn't have the infrastructure.
Thank you for that. And just to follow up, that's one of our key problems, I think, this time around because of the 2-year limitation on the expenditure of the funds. It's put increased pressure upon the states to use that money and use it quickly within that 2-year period. So they can't really get bogged down with the procurements. So they want the procurements done ASAP. And that's what we're struggling with right now. There's the new requirement for the performance guarantees and the penalties. Now, in contracting, generally speaking, that's always a very difficult area, one, to quantify and two, to enforce. The courts look at those provisions and scrutinize them very heavily. So my question to you is, are you going to be providing the states any guidance with respect to these performance guarantees and liquidated damages clauses that you're going to be looking for and auditing for to better help us? And of course, we want to include clauses that are going to be enforceable. Even just quantifying the damages and making the liquidated damages relate to any possible damages we may incur is a difficult feat. And to do it yesterday, as our officials want us to do.
And this is where you hear the official OIG cop-out. We are not part of management. And so if we advise management on how to put something in there, and it's like anything else, we haven't thought it all the way through, and then we couldn't audit it because we're telling them how to do it. Now, going to this training, we are going to have some conversations with CPD on some what guidance we would like to see them further, and the things that you're mentioning are exactly part of the conversation I'm planning to have later on this week with the CPD staff, to say these are the type of things that you need to talk about, especially the 2-year window for obligations. And I know for a lot of you that aren't federal budget people that understand what these term for money, the limit on the money is doing and impacting is going to be a great impact. But you can actually be able to do portions of that. It doesn't all have to be up front. And that's where you're going to get this big political pressures to push some of this up front. But it's going to be really thinking about how we can carry out our workload and carry that out to the maximum where we're not locking all of our money in the first 2 years. Because the other problem with that action plan is if your action plan comes out and says we're going to do this and you don't spend it within that 2-year period, you're not going to be able to move it to someplace else. And that money's subject to recapture by the Congress. So that's going to be a conversation I plan to have with CPD to get some additional guidance out, just based on the conversations we heard here. And that's why we're happy to be here, providing some of that background information to them. But we can't dictate how to do a program, because then we couldn't audit it. And that's part of our independence. Mm-hmm.
And thank you to the Office of Inspector General team for joining us. And much of the language that you see in the notice, aside from what's put into the Appropriations Act related to financial controls and procurement, that's been from conversations we've had with the OIG, but also from reading audits, where these have been the concerns that were laid out, and with our grantees and working through our own recommendations on how to strengthen it going forward. And so we are affirming the commitment. Once we can get some additional feedback, we will push that out to grantees so that you will have it. That being said, this doesn't negate the fact that you still have, of course, procurement responsibilities. And that's where, again, in the Appropriations Act, pay attention to our requirement in the notice where it asks for aligning your procurement standards. Show us how you're meeting what is normally required in 8536, or that you've adopted the section of the federal regulations in 24 Part 85 on procurement. That gets us a lot closer to having an affirmative stance on, yes, we understand what their procurement policies are. Certainly implementation is the second half. Follow the policies. Many of our grantees have been angered or disappointed that the thing that struck them the most is that the IG pointed out that you didn't actually follow your policies, even though you had proper controls to account for these. Before we break, I want to note there were two questions that came up from DOB before we head into our networking break. DOB, duplication of benefits, for those who weren't in the room. I wanted to point out for those who were looking at the examples for FEMA, keep in mind when you're asking beneficiaries, when you're asking applicants for information, FEMA provides a host of assistance, some of which for what you would consider household goods and emergency items that you would never cover. And so it's important to recognize if you already know what that FEMA assistance is for, that's not what or I should say, if you already know what it's for and it's for those things that aren't being contemplated in, say, your rehab programs, we're not talking about a duplication scenario there. So just because it's FEMA assistance doesn't mean it's automatically a duplication of any rehab program, say, that you're providing. The key is that you must find out what it's for. And I just wanted to note that. I think that was raised by one of the grantees as well. With that, I know we're right up on time, so we'll go ahead into our network break and continue.